Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. History is full of kings who conquered, killed, or at least looked decent in a portrait. And then, there was Charles II of Spain, a man whose jaw jutted out like a ship's prow, whose bloodline resembled a Mobius strip, and whose most decisive political move was not choking on his own tongue. He was born from so much inbreeding, it's a wonder his genes didn't file for divorce. He couldn't chew food properly, couldn't string a coherent sentence together, and, perhaps most tragically for a king, couldn't produce an heir. Spain entrusted its vast empire to a man who could barely hold his bladder. But make no mistake, Charles II wasn't just unlucky. He was the final, wheezing punctuation mark at the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. A royal experiment in what happens when you confuse divine right with "let's marry our niece again." Welcome to the slow-motion car crash of European royalty, when the family tree went circular and the consequences that followed. To understand Charles II of Spain, the king who couldn't chew, rule, or reproduce, we must first accept one unpleasant truth. He never had a chance. Not a political chance, not a biological one, and certainly not a genetic one. The man was born broken, not by divine punishment or a vengeful curse, but by something far more insidious: royal family planning. Charles II was not merely a sick king. He was the natural conclusion of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties treating its bloodline like a fine wine. Kept pure, closed off, and lovingly fermented for too long until it turned to vinegar. His deformities were not isolated. They were inherited. His infertility, his developmental delays, his famously protruding jaw, none of it was random. It was decades, even centuries, in the making. And the ones to thank for that? The House of Habsburg, empire builders, dynasty protectors, and unintentionally, creators of one of the most tragic cautionary tales in hereditary history. This is the story of how an empire's obsession with pure blood led to its own degeneration, one royal marriage at a time. It's a tale of well-intentioned political strategy, blindly repeated rituals, and decisions so comically short-sighted, they make even the worst soap opera look subtle. Let's begin, as the Habsburgs would, with the family. The House of Habsburg was not known for subtlety. By the 16th century, they had become one of Europe's dominant powers, ruling over Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, and most importantly for our purposes, Spain. This wasn't accidental. The Habsburgs were master diplomats. While other rulers were stabbing their rivals in the back or launching bloody campaigns, the Habsburgs were doing something even more dangerous: arranging marriages, preferably with each other. The family motto might as well have been "conquer through kissing cousins," because from the early 1500s onward, they pursued a policy of dynastic inbreeding with a determination that can only be described as suicidal. The Habsburgs were so committed to preserving their royal bloodline that they rarely married outside their own extended family. The result was a family tree that wasn't so much a tree as it was a bramble of incestuous knots, looping, twisting, and doubling back on itself until the same ancestors appeared over and over again. Why did they do this? Power. The Habsburgs believed that by keeping their lineage pure, they could keep their empire secure. Foreign alliances through marriage were considered risky, unpredictable, and, most horrifying of all, potentially diluted. So instead of marrying their children to distant nobles in France or England, they looked inward: cousins, nieces, uncles. Over and over, their family tree became less oak and more figure eight. And nowhere was this policy more pronounced than in the Spanish branch of the family. Let's follow the genealogy, shall we? Start with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. He was the grandson of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, those two charming people who funded Columbus and launched the Inquisition. Charles V inherited both Spanish and Austrian territories, and in 1556, he decided to split the empire between his brother Ferdinand, who took Austria and the imperial title, and his son Philip II, who took Spain, the Americas, and a growing sense of dread. Philip II, to put it kindly, was a devout Catholic and a fervent believer in both divine right and cousinly affection. He married 4 times, twice to close relatives. His 4th and final marriage, at the age of 42, was to his 23-year-old niece, Anna of Austria. Yes, niece, his own sister's daughter. Together, they produced Philip III of Spain, who was predictably the product of genetic repetition. Philip III then married his cousin Margaret of Austria, and their son, Philip IV, kept the trend going by marrying his own niece, Mariana of Austria. This brings us to Charles II, the product of uncle-niece marriage. Twice over, on both his mother's and father's sides, the same Habsburg ancestors appear again and again in his lineage: Maximilian I, Mary of Burgundy, Joanna the Mad. His pedigree, if printed out, would look less like a family tree and more like an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail while wearing a crown. Modern geneticists have analyzed Charles II's ancestry and calculated his coefficient of inbreeding at 0.254. To the uninitiated, that might sound abstract. To a geneticist, it's horrifying. For comparison, a child of two unrelated people has a coefficient of 0. A child of first cousins scores about 0.0625. A child of siblings would be 0.25. Charles II? He beat that. He had more genetic overlap than a hypothetical baby born to brother and sister. You might say he was overachieving in all the worst categories. The results were as expected. Charles II was born in 1661, and from the beginning, he showed signs of profound disability. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk properly until 8. His head was enormous in proportion to his weak, frail body. His lower jaw jutted out so far that he couldn't close his mouth, and his tongue was so thick that his speech was barely intelligible even as an adult. Eating was a daily ordeal. His teeth didn't meet. Chewing was nearly impossible. Most of his food was mashed, soaked, or pre-chewed by others. His meals were often interrupted by coughing fits or choking, and yet the court physicians recorded this with all the detached formality of a butcher, noting that a ham is slightly undercooked. After all, nothing to worry about. He's the king. Mentally, Charles was clearly delayed. While not intellectually void, he showed little ability to concentrate, to make complex decisions, or to grasp the intricacies of governance. His education was minimal, and his tutors, many of whom were priests, frequently gave up in frustration. Instead of political strategy or philosophy, Charles was taught religious ritual and superstition, and he took to them with disturbing enthusiasm. He became convinced later in life that he was under the influence of witchcraft and spent much of his reign performing exorcisms on himself, his palace, and occasionally his breakfast. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's stay focused on the people who made him. One might reasonably ask, didn't anyone in the court object to this inbreeding? Wasn't there a single voice of dissent? A bold advisor, perhaps, who suggested marrying outside the family tree? The answer is sort of. There were whispers. Foreign observers certainly noticed. French ambassadors described Charles II as horrific in appearance and utterly incapable of ruling. Venetian envoys were even more direct, calling him mentally disabled and barely coherent. But within Spain, the atmosphere was one of denial bordering on religious fanaticism. The Habsburgs ruled by divine right. To question the legitimacy of the bloodline was to question God's will. So they didn't question it. Instead, they spiritualized it. Charles's problems weren't genetic, they were spiritual. He wasn't malformed because of centuries of incest, he was bewitched. Clearly, someone had cast a spell on the royal seed, blocking his ability to produce heirs. Priests and exorcists were summoned. Holy relics were applied. Saints were petitioned. Nothing worked, but that didn't stop them from trying. The Spanish court even went so far as to exhume the remains of royal ancestors to cleanse the family line. In one especially surreal episode, Charles ordered that the tombs of past kings be opened so that mass could be said in their presence. An attempt, apparently, to purify the bloodline retroactively. Picture a room full of decaying skeletons and a terrified monarch whispering prayers into the dust. Now ask yourself if this sounds like the behavior of a functioning head of state. But again, Charles was not an anomaly. He was the result. He didn't fall from the sky malformed. He was manufactured, produced by a system so obsessed with heritage that it forgot to check whether the machine still worked. The Habsburgs had built their empire on the idea that royal blood was sacred. They guarded it like a relic, preserved it like a museum piece. And in doing so, they ensured its corruption. Even the Habsburgs' supposed genius for political marriage had collapsed into farce by the time Charles was born. The alliances they secured by marrying cousins had long since ceased to produce stability. What they produced instead were kings who couldn't rule, queens who couldn't conceive, and entire courts that operated on delusion. And it wasn't just Spain. The Austrian Habsburgs, too, suffered the effects of their genetic tightrope walk. Though not as extreme, their rulers also displayed signs of physical and mental decline. But Spain bore the worst of it, possibly because, unlike Austria, it clung more stubbornly to the ideology of spiritual authority. Where Vienna might consult doctors, Madrid brought in inquisitors. The truth is, Charles II was less a man than a mirror. He reflected the consequences of centuries of misplaced priorities. His reign, if we can call it that, was not an era of ambition, conquest, or glory. It was a prolonged exercise in political theater, with everyone pretending that things were fine, that God had chosen him, and that the empire was not, in fact, collapsing under its own weight. In reality, Spain was bleeding. Economically, it was faltering. Its overseas empire was slipping away. Its armies were outdated, its bureaucracy bloated, and its treasury perpetually bankrupt. And yet, instead of reforming, the empire stared lovingly at its failing monarch and insisted that the system worked. If anything, Charles was a tragic victim of his own mythos, his own dynasty's refusal to accept biological reality. And that is the darkest irony of all. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving the divine order. In truth, they were designing its downfall. The more they married within, the more they broke what they were trying to protect. Charles II wasn't cursed. He was programmed. By policies. By traditions. By centuries of marriages that defied genetics in favor of pride. And still, he was king. If Charles II of Spain was the physical embodiment of genetic collapse, then the Spain he inherited was its geopolitical equivalent. A once mighty empire that couldn't walk straight, couldn't speak clearly, and most definitely couldn't produce anything of substance anymore. The kingdom and the king mirrored each other with eerie precision. Both were bloated with inherited glory, riddled with dysfunction, spiritually tortured, and pretending, always pretending, that things weren't quite as bad as they looked. This is not the story of a sudden downfall. Spain in the 17th century did not explode, implode, or burn in dramatic fashion. No, that would require energy, initiative, or at least a decent villain. What happened instead was far more Spanish. The empire died slowly, stiffly, dressed in embroidered silk, and clutching a crucifix. It was a grand, tedious decline, the kind that takes generations, dozens of circular meetings, and a few hundred rosaries to truly complete. And yet, for all its decay, this was still the Spain of the Habsburgs. The Spain of conquistadors and gold-laden galleons. The Spain that had once terrified half of Europe simply by pointing its finger. This segment will look at how that same Spain spent the 1600s staggering like a confused, elderly bishop, chanting hymns while its colonies smoldered, its treasury collapsed, and its throne grew more symbolic by the day. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. This is boring history, after all. Let us begin with the shadow of Charles V, the first Habsburg emperor to unite Spain and the Holy Roman Empire under one person. He had a truly global empire, the empire on which the sun never sets. And it sounded great in speeches. But in practice, it was a logistical nightmare. Governing Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and newly conquered lands in the Americas was not just difficult. It was physically impossible. Even Charles V knew it. He eventually abdicated in 1556, splitting his holdings. Austria and the imperial title went to his brother Ferdinand I, while Spain and its overseas possessions went to his son, Philip II. This split was supposed to make things manageable. Instead, it laid the groundwork for parallel decline. Two increasingly unstable houses, each clinging to the same inbred gene pool, but we'll stay focused on the Spanish branch for now. Philip II ruled from 1556 to 1598, and it's fair to say that he worked hard. Very hard. He micromanaged everything. He tried to rule every corner of the empire personally, from a cold, isolated room in the Escorial Palace, surrounded by files, papers, and religious advisors. The man didn't delegate. He didn't sleep. He also didn't realize he was running an empire that was quite literally running out of steam. Under Philip II, Spain experienced its first major economic warning signs. War after war drained the treasury. The Dutch revolted. England became hostile. The Spanish Armada was sent off to invade in 1588 and returned home in pieces. If it returned at all. That campaign alone cost Spain roughly 10 million ducats. For context, that's the equivalent of backing a Netflix medieval drama series with actual ships, cannonballs, and death. And what did Spain get for its trouble? Ruinous debt. Not once, not twice, but 4 national bankruptcies during Philip II's reign. It was as if the Spanish crown discovered financial collapse and liked it so much they made it an annual tradition. Of course, Spain had an ace up its sleeve, the Americas. Or so it thought. Throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries, galleons laden with silver and gold poured into Seville and Cadiz from the New World. Vast fortunes were extracted from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, making Spain incredibly wealthy on paper. But rather than investing in local industry or infrastructure, the Spanish monarchy used this newfound treasure to fund wars, pay foreign mercenaries, and keep the aristocracy padded in velvet and useless titles. The result? Inflation. Staggering inflation. By the early 1600s, prices in Spain had quadrupled. Ordinary people were priced out of basic goods, while nobles and the church remained tax-exempt, floating above the chaos in carriages pulled by exhausted peasants. Worse still, Spain became addicted to imported goods. Cloth came from the Low Countries, weapons from Germany, books, in the rare event someone read one, from France or Italy. Spain became a cautionary tale in early globalization. It had all the money and none of the sense. It was the lottery winner who bought 50 camels and forgot to pay rent. The influx of silver didn't make Spain stronger. It made it bloated, lazy, and arrogant. Its own industries withered under the weight of foreign luxuries, and the Spanish economy became a parasitic court economy. Rich at the top, starving at the base. Nowhere was Spain's decline more visible, or more bureaucratically documented, than in its government. The Spanish Habsburg court developed a bureaucratic system so elaborate, so detailed, and so utterly disconnected from reality that it remains the gold standard for paper-pushing mediocrity. Council after council, of Castile, of the Indies, of war, of finance, each with overlapping jurisdictions, endless memoranda, and no capacity for rapid decision-making. Letters from the colonies could take months to reach Madrid. Once received, they were passed from desk to desk, committee to committee, until some bleary-eyed secretary declared it too complicated and filed it away next to a half-written prayer. And then there were the validos, royal favorites who governed in place of the monarch. Because by the 17th century, Spain's kings weren't just tired. They were disengaged. Philip III, 1598 to 1621, handed power to the Duke of Lerma, a man more interested in enriching his family than governing. Philip IV, 1621 to 1665, Charles II's father, delegated everything to the Count Duke of Olivares, an ambitious man who tried to reform the empire and instead broke it further. These favorites were not elected, rarely accountable, and often corrupt. Yet they were the ones running Spain, while the monarchs themselves receded behind religious rituals and ceremonial functions. Power became both absolute and absent. The king was everywhere in theory and nowhere in practice. This governing style, if we may call it that, produced a kind of majestic paralysis. Decisions were delayed for months, sometimes years. Royal edicts contradicted one another. Provinces were left to fend for themselves, while the central government issued more orders than it could enforce. A particularly Spanish flavor of political absurdity emerged. A monarchy that demanded obedience while providing little in return. A court that praised itself for its piety while bleeding the countryside dry, and a system so addicted to its own rituals that it no longer noticed the world slipping through its fingers. You might say Spain was suffering from institutional senility. Everything still appeared majestic on the outside, velvet robes, gold threads, cathedrals, but inside it was forgetful, confused, and quietly rotting. Of course, no discussion of 17th century Spain would be complete without discussing its greatest obsession, Catholicism. Spain was not merely a Catholic country. It was the Catholic country, the most Catholic of all majesties, defender of the faith, sort of the Counter-Reformation. And if that sounds grandiose, that's because it was supposed to. Religion was not simply a spiritual matter. It was policy, propaganda, and national identity rolled into one. Under the Habsburgs, Spain became a theocratic monarchy in all but name. Religious orthodoxy was enforced by the Inquisition, an institution that had by this point become less about rooting out heresy and more about providing comfortable jobs for paranoid men with degrees in Latin and torture. Thousands of people were investigated, humiliated, or executed, not for rebellion or treason, but for saying the wrong prayer, owning the wrong book, or failing to confess at the right time of year. Science, innovation, and reform were all viewed with suspicion. Protestantism was heresy. Rationalism was heresy. Anything that smacked of change was heresy. Even economic logic, such as the idea that perhaps taxing the peasantry into starvation was not a long-term plan, was met with bafflement. Change implied criticism, and criticism implied blasphemy. So Spain, clinging to its purity, kept building churches while its ships rotted, kept printing saints' lives while its economy collapsed, and kept burning books while its rivals burned ahead. A society frozen in place. While Spain's ruling classes retreated into ritual and ideology, its society followed suit. The 17th century was an age of stratification. The nobility ballooned in size, not by merit but by purchase. Hundreds of new titles were sold to anyone who could afford them. You didn't need land or troops, just money. It was essentially a subscription service for aristocracy. And once you joined, you were exempt from taxes. Nobles didn't work. That was for peasants. They didn't pay tax. That was for peasants too. As for the church, it owned nearly 1/5 of all land in Spain and paid even less. The result? A tax burden that fell almost entirely on the poorest classes: farmers, artisans, and merchants, the very people responsible for growing food and moving goods. These were the ones conscripted for war, harassed by bureaucrats, and squeezed dry by a state that called it piety. Peasant revolts occasionally flared up, but they were swiftly crushed, if not by soldiers then by starvation. Spain's solution to unrest was to wait for people to die or leave. And leave they did. Whole regions of Castile became depopulated. Towns shrank. Roads fell into disrepair. Infrastructure, such as it was, crumbled. And all the while, the court continued as before: balls, processions, exorcisms. No one at the top seemed particularly concerned. There was always another relic to venerate, another royal marriage to plan, another fast to observe in the name of public morality. Meanwhile, in the Spanish Americas, the situation was not exactly a golden age of governance. Colonial officials sent back reports of rebellion, corruption, and administrative chaos. These were usually ignored. Spanish America was supposed to be the empire's lifeline, its source of silver, sugar, and salvation. In practice, it became a slow-draining siphon of mismanagement. Governors ruled like feudal lords, communication with the crown was sporadic, and most viceroys were chosen not for competence but for connections. It wasn't so much a system of rule as a long-distance grift. Indigenous populations continued to be exploited under the encomienda and repartimiento systems, despite the theoretical protections of the crown. Revolts were met with brutal suppression, then forgotten. Pirates preyed on coastal cities. Local elites grew wealthier, while peninsular Spaniards fretted over how to keep them subordinate. The seeds of Latin American independence weren't yet blooming, but they had certainly been planted, in the indifference and arrogance of Madrid. And then there was the king himself. In this swirling mess of bureaucracy, inflation, superstition, and collapse sat Charles II, sickly, silent, and symbolic. Charles was born in 1661 and inherited the throne at the age of 4, following the death of his father Philip IV. His mother, Mariana of Austria, also his father's niece, and therefore his cousin's daughter, do keep up, became regent. She spent much of her time consulting confessors and hoping Charles would become fertile through prayer. He didn't. As Charles matured, the Spanish court increasingly resembled a haunted monastery. He was not capable of leading armies or debating policy. He could barely walk down a hall without assistance. He was kept out of sight from the public, surrounded by priests, and fed soft foods in silence. When he did appear, he spoke in slurred, barely coherent phrases. But his presence, his very survival, was treated as a divine miracle. And that, perhaps, is the most tragicomic element of it all. Charles II didn't choose to be king. He didn't ask to be the final chapter in a dying dynasty. He was a boy born into ceremonial grandeur and biological ruin. While Spain crumbled around him, he prayed, blinked, and aged slowly into a ghost of a monarch. By the late 1600s, Spain had become a kingdom of gestures. It gestured at war. It gestured at religion. It gestured at government. But the movements were hollow, disconnected from action. It was a theater of grandeur performed in slow motion, where every actor forgot their lines but continued to bow on cue. The empire was fading but still dressed in velvet. Its cities were stagnant, but its cathedrals glowed with candles. Its people suffered, but its nobles toasted to eternity. And its king, poor, pitiful Charles, sat in his velvet chair, watching it all unfold through heavy, drooping eyelids. He was not a monarch in the traditional sense. He was a relic, a living relic. And around him, the world moved on. Spain's golden age had ended, not with a bang, but with a limp. And as we will soon see, that limp turned into a fall. Because eventually, even the ghosts must leave the stage. Charles II of Spain, he was not the villain of this story. Nor, despite the temptations of Gothic storytelling, was he the hero. Charles was the final act, the flickering candle at the end of a long, smoky procession of cousins marrying cousins and calling it policy. He was not the architect of Spain's decline. He was quite literally its symptom. And that's important to remember, because to mock Charles is not to mock the man. It is to point out what happens when power ignores biology, responsibility, and reason for long enough to crown a boy who couldn't walk until the age of 6. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, in Madrid. It should have been a triumph. The long-awaited male heir to the throne of Spain, last descendant of the great Habsburg line in Iberia. Cannons fired, bells rang, Te Deums were sung. His mother, Mariana of Austria, who, for the record, was also the niece of her husband Philip IV, presented the baby prince to the court as a divine gift. A miracle child, proof that God had not abandoned Spain. What the court did not say, what many must have noticed but dared not whisper, was that the child looked off. The head was unusually large. The limbs were thin and weak. His eyes drifted in different directions, his mouth hung open, and his tongue was too big for his mouth. The early signs were there from day one, but no one spoke them aloud. Because Charles wasn't just a baby. He was a symbol, and symbols aren't supposed to drool. If you've ever seen a portrait of Charles II, you'll understand the dilemma. Spanish court painters, unlike their Venetian or Flemish counterparts, weren't allowed to embellish freely. But neither could they be too honest. Their job was to produce truthful flattery, a likeness of the king that captured his essence without drawing attention to his, well, essence. And so Charles appears in oil paintings with elongated features, delicate hands, and the sallow, melancholic eyes of someone who has just realized his entire bloodline is an accident. His most famous portraits show him with a prominent jaw, so large it looks like he's storing something in it for winter, and a limp mouth that, even in paint, seems unable to shut. He does not exude strength. He exudes inertia. Modern observers might diagnose this as mandibular prognathism, a condition common among the Habsburgs, but much worse in Charles's case. His tongue was so large and uncoordinated that he often slurred or mumbled. In public ceremonies, his speeches were read for him. Even as a child, he was accompanied by handlers, nannies, tutors, guards, because he could not walk alone for long. He suffered frequent gastrointestinal issues. He was nearly deaf at times, likely epileptic, and, if the palace records are to be believed, chronically afflicted with infections, headaches, and fatigue. In today's terms, Charles would be diagnosed with a bouquet of genetic disorders: probable hypogonadism, hydrocephalus, pituitary dysfunction, and cognitive delay. His entire endocrine system appeared underdeveloped. His immune system weak. His reproductive system tragically non-functional. But in the 17th century, none of this had a name. It only had interpretations, and most of them involved demons. You might be asking, surely someone noticed? Yes. Everyone noticed. The problem was not a lack of observation. It was a surplus of symbolism. Charles wasn't a boy. He was Spain, the living embodiment of God's will. And if Charles was defective, if he couldn't rule, couldn't speak, couldn't walk or father children, then what did that say about the divine order? To avoid this awkward theological question, the court did what it did best. It staged a pageant of plausible deniability. Charles's defects were spiritual, not genetic. His weaknesses were the work of sorcery, not recessive alleles. His frailty was God's test of national piety. And so, the ceremonies continued. Baptisms, blessings, public masses. When Charles was 4 and still not speaking, priests performed blessings on his tongue. When he reached 6 and couldn't stand unaided, prayers were held in every cathedral in Castile. The Spanish court didn't seek medical intervention. It held novenas. It summoned exorcists. To speak openly of Charles's condition was considered a form of disloyalty. Ambassadors wrote letters home describing the king as barely coherent or hideously malformed. But within Madrid, the fiction remained intact. The boy was delicate, yes, but not damaged. He was a child of miracles. And perhaps, with enough fasting and holy water, the miracles would arrive. They never did. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for Spanish statecraft, the outside world did not share Madrid's compulsion to pretend. Foreign ambassadors, ever practical, filed detailed and brutally honest reports about the boy king. The Marquis de Villars, ambassador from France, wrote candidly, "This poor prince is so ugly as to cause fear. and he can hardly speak or walk. The Venetian envoy added with typical Italian precision. The Catholic Majesty has a head too large for his frame, a jaw that hangs, a tongue too thick, and a body that seems unwilling to obey his thoughts, if such thoughts exist. The Austrian court, ironically his closest relatives, tiptoed around the issue with slightly more decorum. But even they could not deny the reality. Charles was not fit to rule, not physically, not mentally, and certainly not politically. But the absurdity ran deeper. These reports, circulating quietly through Europe, did nothing to change Spain's official posture. As far as the Spanish court was concerned, the boy was perfectly fine. He simply needed time. And prayer. Lots of prayer. Thus, for years, foreign dignitaries would visit the royal court to observe a ceremony, only to be greeted by a slack-jawed child dressed in ornate robes, staring blankly at a silver cross while everyone around him nodded solemnly, as if this, too, were evidence of divine providence. The king might be drooling, but the empire, supposedly, was intact. Education for Charles II was treated with the same grim theatricality as his health. It was performed, not pursued. A series of tutors and priests were appointed to instruct him in Latin, history, theology, and political philosophy. Their job was not to develop a ruler, but to generate the appearance of one. Records show that Charles struggled with basic reading and writing well into his teens. He rarely engaged in sustained conversation. He was known to repeat phrases without understanding their meaning and to fixate on small details with childlike obsession. His emotional maturity appeared stunted. Courtiers noted frequent fits of laughter, weeping, and confusion, often within the same day. When actual state matters were discussed, Charles was usually present in body, but not in mind. Ministers learned to direct their speeches toward his advisors, or to skip the king entirely. The throne became a chair occupied by a man whom no one expected to think, but everyone expected to bless their decisions with silent nods and holy lineage. And yet, Charles loved ritual. He adored processions, robes, incense, and religious art. He was devout to the point of obsession and spent hours each day in prayer. One courtier remarked, not unkindly, that Charles was perhaps better suited to be a monk than a monarch. But monks, to their credit, did not command armies or determine succession treaties. Charles, tragically, did. It is tempting to ask what Charles's doctors thought. The answer is, not much. Because by the 17th century, Spanish court medicine had become a bizarre mixture of theology, Galenic theory, superstition, and blind hope. Charles's royal physicians treated him with a range of therapies that would be laughable if they weren't so cruel. These included bloodletting, frequent, to balance the humors, emetic potions, to purge evil substances, enemas, multiple times per week, herbal poultices, heated stones, and prayers whispered directly into his ears. When these failed, as they invariably did, the court turned to spiritual remedies. Charles was regularly blessed by holy relics. He touched the bones of saints. He wore scapulars, medals, and protective talismans sewn into his garments. At one point, the court consulted astrologers to determine whether planetary alignments were interfering with his development. The answer, unsurprisingly, was yes. In 1690, Charles underwent an official exorcism, sanctioned by his confessor. The purpose? To drive out the demons believed to be obstructing his fertility. The ceremony involved holy water, Latin incantations, and the invocation of Saint Isidore. It did not work. Later, his advisors arranged for the king to sleep with a wax figurine of a virgin martyr, believing that its purity might transfer to him via osmosis or divine leakage. This also did not work. The entire medical approach, in sum, resembled a slow-motion drowning in holy water. The real tragedy of Charles's early life is not that he was unwell. It's that no one was allowed to admit he was unwell. A court dedicated to appearances above all else treated Charles not as a human being, but as a divine placeholder. He was the final branch of the Spanish Habsburgs, and thus his mere existence, however limited, was proof that the empire continued. What could not be permitted was change. No foreign prince could be named heir. No internal reform could be made to succession laws. No courtiers dared suggest bypassing the king, because doing so would mean facing a terrifying question. What happens when the king is no longer capable of kingship? Rather than face that, the court wrapped Charles in layers of ritual, myth, and protocol. He became, as one historian aptly put it, a living relic, wheeled out for ceremonies, consulted for appearances, and otherwise hidden from view. By the 1670s, It was clear that Spain's political apparatus was built around a vacuum. Charles II was nominally the king of an empire that spanned multiple continents. But in practice, governance was carried out by a rotating cast of nobles, confessors, and ministers. These men wielded extraordinary power, not because they were capable, but because the king was not. Every appointment became a miniature war. Every ambassador, bishop, or general owed their position not to the king's will, but to the intrigues of whoever happened to control access to him at the time. Factions formed, pro-French, pro-Austrian, pro-piety, pro-sorcery, and each claimed to speak for Charles. Meanwhile, Charles, ailing, gentle, and mostly confused, drifted from room to room, reciting prayers and asking when dinner would be served. The most important man in Spain was also its most powerless. He was the keystone of a collapsing archway. The court could not function without him, but it also could not function with him. And so, it functioned around him. Among the Spanish populace, rumors circulated. Was the king bewitched? Was he being poisoned by foreign powers? Why had he not produced an heir? In an era before newspapers, information moved slowly, but gossip moved fast. Whispers grew louder. Charles was hidden from public view for long stretches of time. When he did appear, he looked increasingly emaciated, disoriented, and unable to speak. His jaw sagged. His gaze wandered. His steps faltered. He resembled, as one noble whispered, a skeleton in a crown. And yet, he continued to reign. Not by doing, but by being. And that was enough, for a while. In most royal courts, the transition from boy to man was carefully choreographed. Coming-of-age rituals, first appearances at council, betrothal ceremonies. Each served as milestones on the path to becoming a monarch in full. In Charles II's case, this path was theoretical. He reached puberty in terms of age, but not in function. His body remained frail and undeveloped. His voice stayed high-pitched and uncertain. His thoughts, when spoken aloud, came in fragments, whispers, or repetitions. Those around him began to quietly admit, only in the most trusted circles, that the king may never fully develop. But what does a court do when its monarch is legally adult, biologically immature, and cognitively stalled? The answer, at least in 17th century Spain, was arrange a marriage and pray harder. The year was 1679, and Europe was already sniffing around the Spanish throne like wolves at the edge of a campsite. Everyone knew the Habsburg line was in trouble. The question was, would Charles produce an heir? Spain's advisors, growing desperate, reached out to France. And thus began the marriage negotiations between Charles II and Maria Luisa of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV. She was 17. Charles was 18, at least on paper. In body and mind, he was years behind. Maria Luisa arrived in Spain full of hope and royal training, a French princess ready to play the part of queen. What she found instead was a husband who appeared more like a sickly child than a sovereign. He was polite. He smiled often. He called her Madrecita, Little Mother, a nickname that would be sweet coming from a child, but alarming from a monarch. Despite repeated efforts, the marriage remained unconsummated for months, then years. The court, naturally, blamed sorcery. Rumors swirled of enchantments, infertility curses, and even magical barriers that prevented the king's seed from traveling properly. Royal doctors prescribed aphrodisiacs, ointments, and spiritual counseling. Exorcists were consulted. Nothing worked. Maria Luisa, who had arrived with high expectations and a gilded French trousseau, began to fade. Her health declined. Her letters back to France grew more despondent. She endured endless ceremonies, endless disappointment, and endless pressure to do the one thing she physically could not, become pregnant. In 1689, after 10 years of ceremonial intimacy and public disappointment, Maria Luisa died suddenly. Officially, the cause was listed as appendicitis. Unofficially, it was heartbreak and exhaustion. She was 26. Charles, now in his late 20s, had still produced no heir. With Maria Luisa dead and Europe watching like vultures, Spain scrambled to find a replacement. The choice was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her sister had given birth to over 20 children. If anyone could solve Spain's dynastic crisis, it would be her womb. Maria Anna was strong-willed, politically savvy, and determined to rule. Qualities that did not endear her to Spain's entrenched and pious court. Her relationship with Charles was cool, distant, and utterly childless. Once again, the couple went through the rituals. Masses were said. Holy relics were deployed. Astrologers were consulted. At one point, A holy water font in the royal bedroom was blessed so often that it reportedly began to crack. Still no heir. The court blamed the queen. The queen blamed the court. The people blamed God. But Charles tragically blamed himself. He became increasingly fixated on his sterility. He wept during confessions. He asked his confessors if he had committed sins in a past life. He fasted, whipped himself, and prayed for forgiveness for unknown offenses. His health, always precarious, began to deteriorate further. By the mid-1690s, Charles II had become a walking corpse. His hair fell out. His skin grew pale and waxen. He suffered frequent seizures, partial paralysis, and long periods of confusion. His physicians reported that his urine had turned black. His stools were bloody. His speech was often unintelligible. He could no longer stand without assistance. And yet, despite this, Spain refused to remove him. The court preferred to believe that his suffering was spiritual, a martyrdom that would redeem the nation. The worse his condition became, the more devoutly people prayed. If miracles existed, surely now was the time. The French ambassador wrote home, "He is a man who lives only through the prayers of his people. There is no nature left in him." The Venetian ambassador described him as a shadow cast upon a throne. Meanwhile, foreign powers ramped up their preparations for war. Louis XIV of France had already maneuvered his grandson into Charles's will. The Austrian Habsburgs began stockpiling arms. England and the Dutch Republic readied their fleets. Everyone could see what was coming. Everyone except, perhaps, the king himself. In these final years, Charles II stopped being a monarch and became a religious artifact. He was carried from chapel to chapel, from reliquary to relic, his body breaking down while his court held ever more elaborate ceremonies. He asked to be buried in a monk's habit. He spoke of sin, redemption, and the Virgin Mary. He confessed daily. He slept under crucifixes. At one point, he reportedly told his confessor, "I have lived to suffer, so that others may rule." And yet, despite all evidence, despite all suffering, the fiction remained. Charles II was still king, still sacred, still the sun around which the empire turned, even as it collapsed into darkness. Charles II was not a man born to rule. He was a man born because no one dared stop the machine of monarchy. He was the end product of a dynasty that confused bloodline with destiny, that mistook tradition for strength, and that wrapped a fragile, suffering child in the trappings of divine right because it could not imagine a different future. In many ways, Charles was the purest symbol of his age. Beautiful on parchment, disastrous in practice, and painfully aware, at least in moments, that something had gone terribly wrong. His reign was not one of war or glory. It was one of inertia. But in that inertia, he revealed something essential about power, that when you build a system around appearances, the last thing it can survive is the truth. It's one thing to have a king who cannot rule. It's quite another to have a court that insists he does anyway. For all his physical weakness, Charles II wore a crown. He held ceremonies. He signed decrees, though rarely knew what they said. He sat, hunched and blinking, at the heart of one of the largest empires in the world. And for that reason alone, everyone pretended the gears of governance still turned at his command. They didn't. Not even close. Spain under Charles II was not a monarchy in the traditional sense. It was a monarchy-shaped illusion, a gilded theater in which ministers, confessors, and family members operated levers behind velvet curtains, moving the mouth and limbs of a silent, barely conscious puppet. Charles was not ruling the empire. He was haunting it. This segment is about the people who ruled through him. The regents, the courtiers, the faction leaders, the whisperers behind the throne. It is about power in the absence of presence, and about how one of the world's most Catholic empires came to be governed by rumor, ritual, and sheer inertia. When Charles II was born, his father Philip IV was already aging and half-exhausted by decades of war and court intrigue. The boy's mother, Mariana of Austria, had married Philip as a political consolidation between the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburgs, despite also being his niece. She was intelligent, devout, and fiercely protective of her son. And when Philip IV died in 1665, leaving 4-year-old Charles the King of Spain, Mariana became regent. And then she never really stopped. Officially, her regency was meant to last until Charles reached maturity. But when, exactly, was a boy with no clear intellectual development considered mature? This ambiguity suited Mariana perfectly. For over a decade, she maintained full control over Spain's bureaucracy. issuing decrees, managing council meetings, and staffing the royal household with Austrian loyalists. She consulted Jesuits. She exchanged letters with Vienna. She surrounded her son with nurses, eunuchs, and confessors who answered to her, not to the crown. She effectively became the first and last filter through which all information passed, especially the information that Charles might not, in fact, be able to rule anything. Her style of leadership was deeply personal and deeply paranoid. She feared French influence. She feared the nobility. She feared court factions undermining her son, and by extension herself. So she smothered Charles with both affection and constraint. The young king could not bathe, dress, or speak publicly without her permission. He could not choose his tutors. He was rarely left alone. And as Charles grew older, without growing stronger, Mariana continued to justify her grip. She argued, not without some truth, that Spain would collapse if power fell into the wrong hands. What she did not admit was that power already had. In early modern monarchies, physical access to the sovereign was everything. In France, courtiers fought for the right to hand the king his shirt. In Spain, they fought for a glance, a nod, or the chance to adjust Charles's pillow. Because Charles was so often ill or incapacitated, his daily routine was managed by a tightly choreographed series of attendants: valets, chamberlains, confessors, physicians, dwarfs, and ceremonial aides. Each role came with hidden power. If you held the chamber pot, you could pass a message. If you arranged his clothing, you could delay a meeting. If you controlled the seating chart at Mass, you could humiliate a rival. Nothing was too small to be weaponized. These positions were fiercely contested, not by servants, but by nobles and ministers. The closer you stood to Charles's feeble body, the closer you were to the levers of state. And because Charles rarely expressed preferences or opinions, whoever managed his schedule could filter his exposure to people and ideas. As a result, factions began forming not around ideology, but around who got to open the king's door. In most countries, the seal of confession protects the penitent. In Charles II's Spain, it empowered the priest. Because the king was deeply religious, almost fanatically so, his confessors became not just spiritual guides, but political advisors with untraceable influence. They were among the few people who could speak to Charles directly, one-on-one, without anyone else present. And what was said in those sessions? No one else could ever know. This created what historians now call the confessor state, a situation in which royal policy was increasingly shaped not by ministers or law, but by priests. These men were typically Jesuits, loyal to the Church first, to Mariana of Austria second, and to Spain third, if at all. And they understood their role. They did not merely forgive Charles's sins, they directed his worldview. They told him who was good, who was evil, who was trustworthy, and what God wanted him to do. One of the most notorious confessors was Father Froilan Diaz, a Dominican friar with strong ties to ultra-conservative factions. Under his guidance, Charles became convinced that he had been bewitched, and that demons were responsible for his physical weakness and childlessness. Rather than challenge this belief, Diaz encouraged it, organizing exorcisms, promoting court purges, and lobbying against any moderate ministers who questioned the spiritual diagnosis. The result? A palace increasingly ruled by ritual, where decisions were justified by visions, and reforms were blocked because they might offend a saint. Religious orthodoxy became a kind of performance art, and Charles, weak, confused, and terrified, clung to it as his only certainty. In theory, Spain was an absolute monarchy. In practice, it was a playground for foreign policy operatives. The two great powers of Europe, France under Louis XIV and Austria under the Holy Roman Emperor, each had blood claims to the Spanish throne, and neither was willing to wait politely for Charles to die. The court split into two factions. The pro-French party, which sought to align Spain with Louis XIV and secure a Bourbon succession through Charles's French relatives, and the pro-Austrian party, loyal to the Habsburg core in Vienna, which hoped to preserve Spanish autonomy by keeping power within the broader Habsburg dynasty. These weren't just abstract loyalties. They translated into real policies: trade agreements, military alliances, marriage treaties, ambassadorial appointments, and of course, court gossip. Mariana of Austria, unsurprisingly, favored the Austrian side. Her family ties were too strong, and she mistrusted French cultural influence. Charles's first wife, Maria Louisa of Orleans, had been a French princess, but Mariana ensured she was isolated and mistrusted within the palace. When Maria Anna of Neuburg arrived as Queen No. 2, the Austrian camp rejoiced. She immediately joined her mother-in-law's crusade to keep Spain within the Habsburg fold. Together, the two women created a kind of dual regency, one whispering from the chapel, the other commanding from the bedroom. Charles, as usual, was present in name but absent in voice. Meanwhile, ambassadors from France and Austria kept detailed notes, bribed officials, and reported daily to their home courts. Spain was no longer steering its own ship. It was the ship drifting, while rival captains tried to seize the rudder by flattering a king who didn't know which way the wind blew. As Charles aged, though aged is generous, since his body began falling apart long before his 30s, the most urgent political question in Europe became, who would succeed him? He had no children. He was unlikely to produce any. His health declined by the month. And so, the court turned its attention to the king's will. Not his willpower, not his personality, his actual legal testament. Who would Charles name as his heir? In a functioning monarchy, the king would consult advisors, weigh options, consider geopolitical consequences. In Spain, Charles was simply guided. His will was written and rewritten by factions who used religion, superstition, fear, and family guilt to push him toward their preferred candidate. Sometimes he leaned French, sometimes Austrian, sometimes he just cried and prayed. The pressure became unbearable. The court grew paranoid. Ministers spied on each other. Letters were intercepted. Confessors were accused of sedition. Propaganda pamphlets circulated in the streets, claiming that demons had taken over the palace, that Charles had signed a false will, that the Queen was being poisoned, that the Jesuits were planning a coup. And through it all, Charles remained seated, white-faced, shaking, eyes sunken, jaw slack. The monarch, the vessel, the puppet. So if Charles II didn't rule, and the palace was a battleground of squabbling factions and whispering priests, who exactly ran Spain? The short answer: no one consistently. The long answer: a patchwork of ministers, regional councils, and foreign agents, all of whom claimed to act in the king's interest, while avoiding direct responsibility for Spain's ongoing decline. Spain's governing body, the Council of State, technically had the power to draft decrees, manage foreign policy, and advise the king. But in reality, it became a kind of bureaucratic seance, summoning the will of a monarch who was very much alive, but utterly unreachable. Ministers took turns drafting policy memos that Charles either could not understand or was too ill to read. Some were read aloud to him in simplified Latin or Castilian. Others were presented as summaries by Mariana or a confessor. And once a decision was made, usually after hours of debate among people who all claimed to speak for the king, it was issued in his name, signed with a trembling hand guided by someone else's. Meanwhile, local governors, viceroys, and colonial administrators began to drift toward autonomy. In the Americas, Spanish officials made decisions without waiting for Madrid. In Naples, the viceroy governed more like a king. The far-flung limbs of the Spanish Empire continued to twitch, but they no longer moved in coordination. At home, justice slowed. Bureaucratic delays multiplied. Revenues shrank. Bribes became normalized. Petitions sent to the court piled up, because no one could decide what the king wanted, and no one dared say, he wants nothing. He doesn't know what wanting is. To understand how this system endured for decades, one must understand the power of ritual. Spain in the late 1600s was addicted to ceremonial continuity. The throne must be occupied. The crown must be kissed. The king must be present, even if his mind was not. And so rituals continued. Charles II held public audiences where courtiers approached, bowed, and presented petitions he would not remember. He presided over mass with glazed eyes. He touched scrofulous peasants to cure them, a tradition known as the royal touch, despite being barely able to stand. Every gesture was observed, analyzed, repeated. His ability to perform monarchy mattered more than his ability to exercise it. No one wanted to be the one to break the illusion. Saying the king was incapable meant destabilizing the entire system. The illusion was all they had left. Even foreign powers played along, publicly. French and Austrian ambassadors would present formal letters to Charles, then privately admit in correspondence that the king had not spoken a full sentence. But still, the ceremony had to be done. Still, the bow, the title, the acknowledgement. The monarchy was a machine running on inertia, and no one dared cut the power. By the late 1690s, Charles was deteriorating rapidly. His teeth had fallen out. His speech was slurred. His limbs trembled constantly. He was incontinent. He suffered from hallucinations and periods of unconsciousness. And yet, he was still king. In a typical week, Charles might wake late, receive a liturgical blessing, be dressed by 4 attendants, listen to a passage of scripture, sign a document he could not read, and then retreat to his rooms for hours of silence and prayer. Ministers would declare him in good health, and the state would continue. But the truth was obvious to everyone. A French envoy, the Duke of Harcourt, described the king as the mere shadow of a man. His body is reduced to skin and bone, his mind to confusion. The Spanish people, once devout believers in the divine right of kings, began to whisper. Priests in small parishes offered prayers for deliverance. Aristocrats began selling off lands in anticipation of war. And in the streets of Madrid, satirical poems circulated in secret, comparing the royal palace to a crypt and Charles to a corpse dressed in silk. In the final years of his reign, Charles became something even stranger than a failed monarch, a symbol of tragic endurance. He was mourned before he died, pitted even by his enemies. And yet, his role in the drama of Europe was not over. The fight over his succession reached a fever pitch. France and Austria threatened war if the other gained the throne. England and the Dutch tried to negotiate compromises. The Pope weighed in. Charles, as ever, sat at the center of the storm, blinking in confusion. He was asked to sign a final will. He was told to choose an heir. He did, not because he understood the consequences, but because someone he trusted told him it was God's will. And then he waited. For death. For peace. For an ending. Charles II was not merely a sick king. He was the product of a system that could not acknowledge weakness, could not reform, and could not imagine life beyond ritual. His reign was not a reign in any traditional sense. It was an extended state of denial, a slow unraveling of empire disguised as continuity. In the absence of a ruler, Spain did not collapse immediately. It did something worse, it endured. It mimicked governance. It pantomimed power. And by the time Charles died, the illusion was so complete that even his enemies referred to him not with hatred, but with sorrow. He had been a boy in a crown, then a man in chains of duty, then a ghost in royal robes. A puppet, yes, but one held aloft by an entire kingdom afraid to cut the strings. Spain in the late 17th century resembled a once mighty ship run aground, its sails tattered and its captain barely clinging to life. Once hailed as the most formidable empire in the world, master of oceans, conqueror of continents, the hammer of Protestant heresy, Spain had become a creaking relic. The grandeur of Charles V and Philip II was now little more than candlelit nostalgia. Centuries of war and empire had drained the Spanish treasury and spirit. The galleons still came from the Americas, but more slowly now, and with less gold. The bureaucracy was bloated, the nobility increasingly irrelevant, and the peasants, well, they had always suffered, but now they were starving too. Economic stagnation had set in like rot beneath the gilded surface. Meanwhile, military prestige had curdled into military embarrassment. Spain's once feared tercios had become walking jokes, outfought by nearly every rival in Europe. And as if that weren't enough, the king himself, Charles II, was dying. No, scratch that. He had been dying for years. He was born dying. He was conceived dying. Charles was the final product of generations of incestuous marriage within the House of Habsburg, a dynasty that had turned genealogy into genetic roulette. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that he could not chew properly. He drooled incessantly and could hardly speak. His body was frail, prone to seizures, and his intellect, by most contemporary accounts, hovered somewhere between innocent and inert. Foreign ambassadors described him with a cruelty that would be shocking if it weren't so widely agreed upon: childlike, ghost-like, an animated corpse. The Spanish court clung to delusions. Perhaps Charles would recover. Perhaps God would intervene. Perhaps a miracle would finally bless him with a child. Processions were held. Prayers offered. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, reportedly died of despair after failing to conceive. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better despite being surrounded by an entire support system of physicians, exorcists, and astrologers. Nothing worked. The king was infertile. More than that, he was the walking death of a dynasty. By the 1690s, there was no longer any serious debate among informed observers. Charles II was not going to produce an heir. The Spanish Habsburg line, which had ruled for over a century, was going extinct. The great imperial house was at its terminus, and Charles was the flickering candle of its final hour. And that, of course, raised the burning question: who would inherit the Spanish Empire. This wasn't just about Spain. The stakes were global. The Spanish crown controlled not only Iberia, but the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, the Duchy of Milan, the Spanish Netherlands, present-day Belgium, the Americas, parts of Africa, and scattered ports across Asia. Whoever wore the crown of Spain would effectively hold the world's largest empire. That meant that Charles's death was not just a family tragedy. It was a geopolitical earthquake waiting to happen. Every major power in Europe braced for it. France, Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, they all had claims, ambitions, fears. Diplomats began circling like vultures around a barely breathing corpse. Alliances were formed, letters dispatched, secret deals whispered in candlelit salons. All eyes were on the throne of a dying man who could barely raise his head, let alone rule. But he could still sign a will. And that was more than enough to throw the world into chaos. If Charles II was a tragic emblem of dynastic decay, then his empire was the morbidly glamorous corpse that every European royal house wanted to inherit. It was not just a matter of lineage or principle. It was quite simply the biggest political jackpot in the Western world. The Spanish Empire stretched across oceans and continents. It included Mexico and Peru with their silver mines, the Caribbean and the Philippines, rich in trade routes, the Low Countries, critical to northern commerce, and much of southern Italy. A ruler who inherited all of this would immediately gain global prestige, strategic superiority, and the resources to dominate Europe for generations. No sane monarch could ignore it. The real problem was that far too many monarchs thought they were the sane one. Let's meet the top contenders. Young Philip was the second grandson of Louis XIV of France. His mother, Maria Theresa of Spain, had been the older half-sister of Charles II. Yes, she had renounced her claim to the Spanish throne upon marrying Louis. But, and here's the key loophole, her dowry had never been paid. According to France, this nullified the renunciation. According to everyone else, this was a Bourbon fairy tale. Regardless, the French saw an opportunity. If Philip were crowned King of Spain, the two most powerful Catholic monarchies in Europe could become de facto allies, or even a single unified dynasty. The Pyrenees would no longer exist, as Louis XIV would later crow. It was an appealing vision if you were French, or suicidal if you were literally anyone else. On the other side stood the Austrian Habsburgs, led by Emperor Leopold I. Charles II's closest male Habsburg relative was Archduke Charles, the emperor's second son. The Austrians considered their claim ironclad. They were male-line relatives, Catholic, and dynastically consistent. The real problem? Spain had had quite enough of Austrian management. After decades of feeling like a distant province of Vienna, many Spanish nobles were growing weary of Central European interference. Still, the Habsburgs had deep pockets, ancient bloodlines, and the backing of Rome. Of course, not everyone had a direct claim. Some simply wanted to stop the others from winning. The English and the Dutch weren't eager to fight over who would inherit Spain. What they feared was who would inherit Spain and everything that came with it. If the Bourbons gained the Spanish crown, the English Channel would effectively become a Bourbon pond. If Austria took over, Central and Southern Europe would become an Habsburg backyard. So, these maritime powers floated the idea of a compromise, partition. Divide the Spanish Empire into digestible chunks and give each house something. One favored candidate was Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a child of mixed Habsburg and Bavarian lineage. He was young, Catholic, and unthreatening. In 1698, the Treaty of The Hague, also called the First Partition Treaty, proposed that Joseph Ferdinand inherit most of Spain, while France and Austria took smaller territorial bites. It was neat. It was diplomatic. It was even tentatively agreed upon by all major powers. And then Joseph Ferdinand died of smallpox at the age of 6. Back to square one. At the Spanish court, this international Game of Thrones became an internal civil war. The Queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was staunchly pro-Habsburg. She had been raised in the tradition of Catholic Central Europe, and she viewed France with suspicion and disdain. Her court faction, which included powerful nobles, clerics, and Austrian agents, pushed hard for Archduke Charles. Opposing them were the Bourbonists, Spanish nobles who had suffered under Austrian aloofness, French diplomats, and even some clergy who believed Bourbon Spain could revitalize Catholic power against Protestant England and her allies. Bribes flowed like wine. The French ambassador, the Duke of Harcourt, became a master manipulator. He hosted dazzling parties, granted pensions to Spanish grandees, and used subtle propaganda to frame France as Spain's only salvation. One pamphlet distributed in Madrid warned that an Austrian king would treat Spain like a backwater province. A French prince, it claimed, would be a king for Spain, not over Spain. It worked. The Spanish Council of State, a crucial advisory body, began leaning toward Philip. Meanwhile, Charles II grew weaker. Even the Pope had an opinion. Pope Innocent XII, alarmed by the possibility of a massive European war, sent secret missives urging Charles to choose Philip. The French, he reasoned, were better positioned to defend Catholic unity and would uphold the Church's interests. Plus, the Bourbons were more pliable than the Austrian Habsburgs, who had a nasty habit of bossing around bishops. Some historians have suggested that Charles's final decision was influenced by a papal whisper. Others point to Charles's confessor, Father Froilin, who had grown suspiciously pro-French in his final months. It didn't help that the French promised to protect Spanish traditions, let Spaniards rule Spanish territories, and absolutely definitely never ever unite France and Spain. Spoiler, they tried anyway. By the start of 1700, the Spanish royal court had turned into something between a hospice and a diplomatic minefield. Charles II, now barely more than a translucent shadow slumped on a throne, had somehow managed to not die again. His courtiers were baffled. His enemies were frustrated. And Europe, held in suspense by a man who could not even digest food properly, was starting to lose patience. Physicians continued to experiment with treatments that today would be classified as medieval torture or at best deeply unhelpful homeopathy. Bleedings, leechings, enemas, and prayers were prescribed in alternating cycles. His body was wasting away. His teeth were rotting. His speech slurred. But crucially, he was still technically breathing. And as long as Charles breathed, so too did the fantasy that he might still recover, or at least delay the inevitable just long enough for one side to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, the battle to control the king's signature intensified. Each faction, French and Austrian, competed to monopolize access to the royal bedside. Charles's wife, Queen Maria Anna, became increasingly protective. So did his confessor, Father Froilin, a man whose spiritual authority was exceeded only by his ability to be lobbied by foreign agents. A priest with political pull? In Catholic Europe? Shocking. The Spanish Council of State had splintered into factions. Some pushed for neutrality, which was adorable. Others, feeling the rising Bourbon tide, argued that resisting France would only accelerate Spain's disintegration. What Spain needed, they claimed, was not another absent Habsburg emperor with no grasp of Iberian reality, but a young, vigorous Bourbon prince who would revive the monarchy. To complicate things further, partition treaties were still being floated by England and the Dutch Republic. The idea of slicing the empire like a wedding cake and handing out pieces to various suitors may have looked clever on paper, but it had one fatal flaw. Spain wasn't invited to the wedding. The Spanish nobles, regardless of faction, found the very idea insulting. Why should foreign powers carve up Spanish lands without the consent of the king or his people? This wasn't just a legal debate. It was an existential insult to national pride. Queen Maria Anna, sensing the tides turning against Austria, redoubled her efforts to influence Charles's will. She limited visits from French envoys, tightened control over court documents, and funneled information through a tightly guarded network of allies. But even she could not stem the shift in Charles's mind, or what remained of it. The king, increasingly isolated, was plagued by hallucinations, fevers, and spiritual anxiety. He was convinced that demons were haunting him. At one point, exorcists were called in. Not physicians, exorcists. Because clearly, when the fate of global empire hangs in the balance, nothing calms the nerves quite like an emergency demon purge. Every ambassador knew the game was reaching its end. The French had already drafted their preferred version of the will. The Austrians had their own. Papal envoys sent confidential suggestions. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with one of Charles's ceremonial butter knives. As the king's health spiraled further, he was eventually persuaded, through a mixture of appeals, pressure, spiritual terror, and political sleight of hand, to agree to a final decision. He would sign the will. But whose version? In a move that stunned half of Europe and delighted the other, Charles signed the Bourbon document. Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, would inherit the whole Spanish Empire, intact and undivided. Not a partition, not a compromise, a full, undiluted handover to the Bourbon dynasty. The Spanish court erupted, in shock, in outrage, in celebration. Depending on where one stood, It was either a masterstroke of diplomacy or an act of treason against European peace. Some cried for joy. Others began drafting war plans. The will was delivered to foreign embassies. It was now official. The king had made his choice. Europe had just been given its marching orders toward war. And Charles, his final duty performed, retreated into his bedchamber, where he would soon die. Not with glory, not with dignity, but with the dubious honor of having lit the fuse on the War of the Spanish Succession. The last days of Charles II were not dramatic, not glorious, and certainly not dignified. There was no grand farewell, no rousing speech, no last-minute rally of strength. Instead, there was groaning, trembling, coughing, and a strong odor of camphor and despair. Charles did not die like a king. He died like a patient too fragile to be moved and too politically explosive to be ignored. But before he died, he signed. That single act, hand-guided, mind cloudy, eyes flickering, was enough to collapse alliances, redraw borders, and plunge half of Europe into a war that would last over a decade. Charles II, a man with no children, no strength, and arguably no sense of the occasion, became, by his final scribbled flourish, the most consequential monarch in European history. The will was unambiguous. Philip of Anjou, grandson of the Sun King, would inherit everything. Spain, the Americas, the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, Sicily. It was all his. No territorial compromises, no joint governance, no piecemeal division. One empire, one crown, one young Bourbon. Naturally, this was presented as a victory for peace. The French ambassador praised the Spanish court's courage and clarity. Louis Xivy's court exploded with jubilation. The Spanish council, split as ever, tried to claim they had always supported the Bourbon solution. The Jesuits took credit, the Queen took to her bed in despair, and the Austrian Habsburgs exploded in fury. Back in Vienna, Emperor Leopold I reportedly stared at the document and muttered, "So be it." Then he began ordering troops to prepare for war. England and the Dutch Republic, long wary of French expansionism, now realized their worst fear had come true. France and Spain under a single dynasty, encircling them on land and sea. This was not a balance of power. This was Bourbon Europe. And Louis XIV, never one to avoid theatrical missteps, did not help matters when he publicly declared, "The Pyrenees no longer exist." To many, this sounded like a promise. To everyone else, it sounded like a threat. In Madrid, Philip of Anjou was declared King Philip V. He was 17, French, Catholic, and completely unprepared. But he was also polite, handsome, and Bourbon-blooded. In other words, politically useful. Charles's funeral had barely concluded before the new king was paraded through streets that had barely processed one monarch before being asked to cheer for another. Charles's death on November 1st, 1700, closed the chapter on the Spanish Habsburgs. The once glorious house had ended with a whimper, not a bang. But his signature ensured that Europe's next chapter would be anything but quiet. Almost immediately, factions formed. The Grand Alliance, England, the Dutch, Austria, and several German states, banded together to oppose the Bourbon claim. France insisted Philip had a legal right. Spain, exhausted and confused, mostly watched from the sidelines as its territories became chess pieces once again. War was inevitable. The ink had barely dried on the will before armies began to march. And all of it, every shattered alliance, every battlefield soaked in blood, could be traced to the unsteady hand of a dying man who spent his life as a footnote and left the world as a headline. Charles II had not ruled. He had not conquered. He had not even reproduced. But he had done one thing better than anyone else of his time. He had broken Europe with a pen. War was inevitable. The ink had barely dried on the will before armies began to march. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun. A war not for justice, not even for legitimacy, but for fear. Fear that the map of Europe would tilt too far toward one side. Fear that another dynasty might rewrite the rules of the old balance. Fear that, in the end, none of this would matter if everyone ended up buried beneath it. What followed was more than a conflict of kings. It was a sprawling, continent-wide collision of ambition and paranoia. Battles raged in the Low Countries, in Italy on the high seas. Whole cities were leveled, entire generations of soldiers bled into foreign soil, and political theorists twisted themselves into knots justifying the war's necessity. Some called it a war to preserve liberty. Others called it a war to preserve markets. But for the men dying in muddy fields, it was just another war they hadn't asked for. Back in Versailles, Louis XIV prepared to play God. He directed strategy, shuffled diplomats, and placed his grandson on Spain's throne like a chess piece. But the Grand Alliance was not bluffing, and neither were their armies. The great game Charles II had accidentally set in motion was now moving on its own, faster and more destructively than anyone had anticipated. In many ways, Charles II had been Europe's perfect trigger. Harmless, malleable, and doomed. He was the monarch no one feared until it was too late. His death left a throne, a map, and a continent in open question. And when he put quill to paper, he didn't just sign away his empire. He signed away peace. No monarch ruled more softly. No monarch detonated the world more loudly. Charles II had not ruled. He had not conquered. He had not even reproduced. But he had done one thing better than anyone else of his time. He had broken Europe with a pen. And now Europe would burn. By the final years of Charles II's reign, the Spanish crown no longer rested upon a king. It rested upon a myth, a slowly decaying man propped up by ritual, fear, and centuries of inherited delusion. Charles II had become the living embodiment of royal inertia, a monarch in name, a relic in flesh, and a political inconvenience in motion. His existence served one purpose: to delay the inevitable collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line. And so they kept him upright. Barely. In the hallways of the royal Alcazar, courtiers whispered of miracles, curses, and divine punishment. But no whisper was louder than silence, the deliberate, suffocating silence of a court that refused to admit what was plain to every onlooker. The king was dying. He didn't walk so much as he was guided. He didn't speak so much as he mumbled. His eyes, often described as dull and unfocused, had long ceased to reflect anything resembling comprehension. Yet the machinery of monarchy ticked on, as if willing the illusion of leadership to remain. By now, Charles's deformities and illnesses had become the stuff of diplomatic legend. Foreign ambassadors sent home letters that read like horror stories wrapped in etiquette. One described the king's jaw as unable to close. Another claimed he couldn't digest food without vomiting it up whole. The autopsy, when it finally came, allegedly revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn, a body drained of blood, and a brain full of water. Was any of it true? Hard to say. But the myth was just as powerful as the man never had been. To govern Spain in this era was to govern through shadows. Ministers, nuns, and nobles surrounded the king, each competing for influence in a grotesque court ballet. The queen, Mariana of Neuburg, Charles's second wife, took to religious rituals and relics as if they were statecraft. Confessors whispered into ears that still believed sin was the reason Spain was collapsing. And all the while, the king sat there drooling, whispering about demons and destiny. And then there were the doctors. Oh, the doctors. Never before had so many treatments done so little to such little effect. Charles was purged, bled, cauterized, and dosed with every tincture from mercury to powdered skull. His stomach rebelled. His skin broke out. One famed physician prescribed donkey's milk and perpetual prayer. Another recommended he wear sacred medallions under his nightshirt to restore his masculine essence. It's not that Charles was unloved. On the contrary, he was pitted, genuinely, deeply, tragically. Even his enemies didn't hate him. They pitied the boy who had been crowned at 4, buried in ceremonial expectations, and handed a collapsing empire on a silver platter he couldn't lift. But pity is not a strategy. And by the 1690s, Spain had no strategy. Only fear. Everyone knew what came next. Charles II was the last Habsburg of Spain. He had no children. He had no siblings. He had no future. And yet, to speak of a successor was tantamount to treason. Because the day Charles died, Europe would ignite. Thus, the court doubled down on spectacle. Public processions became more frequent. Religious pilgrimages increased. Charles was paraded, pitifully, before crowds who didn't cheer so much as stare. Church bells rang not in triumph, but in ritual reassurance. As long as Charles was alive, the fiction held. The crown still sat on a king's head. And that head, no matter how fragile, was better than war. In his chambers, Charles reportedly spoke often of death, of ghosts, and of judgment. He believed he had been cursed by his ancestors' sins. A fair assessment, given the family tree looked more like a noose than a lineage. Some nights, he ordered mass to be said at midnight, as if to ward off the specter of eternity. Other times, he summoned exorcists, not for demons in the palace, but for demons in himself. The Spain he ruled was already a shadow. The colonies groaned under mismanagement. The treasury was empty. The navy was mostly hulls and memories. And yet, around this dwindling man, rituals continued. For to end the ritual was to admit the empire was over. In the end, Charles II wasn't just a king. He was a vessel, a symbol, a final, flickering ember of a dynasty too proud to extinguish itself. He didn't rule. He endured. And that was all Spain could ask of him. Charles II's body was, to put it mildly, a walking contradiction. He was the product of a centuries-old genetic experiment in dynastic stubbornness, and by the end, his physical form reflected every inch of that cursed pedigree. Though barely in his 30s by the late 1690s, Charles bore the wear of a man 3 times his age. If that man had also survived plague, famine, and perhaps demonic possession. Contemporaries struggled to describe him in ways that balanced courtly etiquette with sheer disbelief. His lower jaw jutted grotesquely forward, a classic Habsburg trait taken to an operatic extreme. It rendered speech difficult, chewing nearly impossible, and his drooling near constant. His tongue, said to be too large for his mouth, only complicated matters. Add to this a sunken chest, spindly limbs, and an unsteady gait, and you had a king who looked less like a monarch and more like a marionette being yanked by invisible, trembling strings. Foreign diplomats often wrote home in tones oscillating between pity and alarm. An English envoy described the king as having so little understanding that he could neither speak nor walk like other men. A Venetian observer noted that Charles's gaze seemed to pass through people, as though he were staring at something only he could see, or perhaps at nothing at all. Then came the infamous autopsy. Performed after his death in 1700, the royal examination read more like a post-mortem of a Gothic novel character than a real monarch. According to reports, his body contained no blood. His heart was shrunken to the size of a peppercorn. His lungs had collapsed. His intestines were gangrenous. His head, most disturbingly, contained no brain, only a head full of water. And in what became the punchline to an empire's genetic tragedy, Charles was allegedly found to have only one withered testicle. The Spanish Empire had gambled centuries of lineage, and it had all come down to that. Were these accounts exaggerated? Perhaps. Was the autopsy propaganda? Possibly. But in the collective imagination of Europe, the image stuck. Charles II became the physical embodiment of a royal house that had pushed its luck too far, married its cousins too often, and refused to read the warning signs even as they were etched into their children's skulls. The legend of Charles's body took on a political life of its own. In coffeehouses in London and pamphlets in Amsterdam, he became a symbol, grotesque, tragic, absurd, of the perils of dynastic arrogance. Artists painted him looking noble and serene, of course. But no amount of powdered wig or gilded portraiture could obscure the truth known to those who had seen him in person. The king was barely functional. Medicine, at the time, offered no hope. Treatments bordered on torture. Physicians alternated between bleeding him to balance the humors, feeding him aphrodisiacs made of ground antlers and beetles, and smearing him with concoctions derived from mummified corpses. Yes, real mummies, Egyptian or otherwise, were considered medicinal delicacies in Baroque Europe. If death wasn't already imminent, these efforts surely sped things along. It wasn't just Charles's body that decayed. His senses dulled, his hearing failed, and his memory sputtered. He would often ask the same questions multiple times a day, forget names of ministers, and confuse his own decrees. Meetings with ambassadors devolved into eerie silences. At court functions, he was often wheeled out, smiled vaguely at the air, and then withdrawn again like a relic too fragile for daylight. But despite all this, despite the smell of sickness, the sagging skin, the gaping mouth and hollow eyes, Spain still paraded him as king. Because admitting he was unfit meant chaos. So they powdered his face, buttoned his coat, and lifted him onto ceremonial thrones. And the myth held. In a court addicted to symbolism, even a ruined vessel could carry the crown. Behind the velvet curtains, the real rulers worked furiously. Ministers, bishops, and foreign envoys all competed for proximity, not to Charles's mind, which had long since become a maze of shadows, but to his name. Every edict bore his seal. Every appointment required his nod, even if he couldn't read it, even if he didn't know he'd done it. A kingdom decaying in the flesh of its monarch. That was the image. A portrait of decay, painted in pallor and perfumed with desperation. And so, Charles II's final years became not just a personal tragedy, but a historical one. A body collapsing, a crown that could no longer support itself, and a court that refused to blink. When medicine failed, and it always did, Charles II's court turned to the other, more esoteric side of the early modern wellness spectrum: mysticism. Surgeons, priests, astrologers, alchemists, and the occasional wandering charlatan passed through the palace gates, summoned not to heal the king, but to keep him from dying long enough for the political world to brace itself. Spain's greatest minds in theology and superstition were invited to diagnose a man they all agreed was beyond earthly aid. What else could one do when the king's body was rotting, his mind flickering like a candle in a crypt, and the fate of an empire rested on his limp shoulders? The palace air was thick with incense and incantation. Priests performed daily rites, invoking saints and martyrs in elaborate Latin chants. Relics were paraded before Charles like magical talismans. They placed the bones of Saint Vincent near his bed. They draped him in holy shrouds. A vial of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, so they claimed, was applied to his chest in hopes it would invigorate his dying heart. And still, he deteriorated. Astrologers were next. They read his natal chart and concluded, quite definitively, that the stars had betrayed him. Born under a cursed conjunction, Mars square Saturn, or some such cosmic indignity, Charles was doomed from birth. The royal astrologer recommended caution, fasting, and Mercury baths. He was quickly dismissed when Charles collapsed mid-ritual. Then came the alchemists. This being the golden age of powdered nonsense, they brought tinctures of unicorn horn, liquefied gold, and solutions derived from frogs' livers. Some concoctions claimed to restore virility, others to purge the melancholic humors said to pool in the king's soul. One infamous mixture, crafted by a French mystic named Jourdain, was administered to Charles over 40 days. It involved ground pearls, deer antlers, and wine infused with crushed emeralds. It succeeded in making him vomit uncontrollably for a week. A sign, they said, that the poison of sin was leaving his body. But not all remedies were swallowed. Some were screamed. By the late 1690s, Charles became convinced that he was the victim of a curse, or worse, demonic possession. He ordered an official exorcism. In the chapel of the Royal Alcazar, the King of Spain, sovereign of a once global empire, sat trembling as monks shouted prayers and commands at invisible spirits. The ritual went on for hours. Charles reportedly wept, trembled, and cried out in pain. When the exorcist asked the demon to name itself, silence followed. The court decided that was a sign it had fled. But Charles did not improve. What followed was a carousel of holy water and desperation. Every miracle worker from Galicia to Naples was summoned. Some laid hands upon the king. Others waved incense and chanted in tongues. One nun, reputed to have visions of the Virgin Mary, claimed she saw a shadow wrapped around the king's spine. She was not invited back. Charles himself believed wholeheartedly in these rituals. He fasted for days on end. He wore sackcloth beneath his royal robes. He confessed 5 times a week, seeking the exact formulation that might unlock divine mercy. At one point, he insisted that a monastery be built in honor of Saint Bartholomew, believing the martyr would save him from whatever malevolent force plagued his loins, lungs, and mind. His confessor, Father Froilan Diaz, became a political actor in his own right, peddling influence, denying audiences, and claiming God had spoken to him directly about the fate of Spain. God, it turned out, was very invested in French succession. None of it helped, but no one dared admit it. The rituals weren't about healing anymore. They were theater, desperate theater, yes, but theater nonetheless. Each exorcism, each relic, each whispered Latin prayer was part of a larger effort to delay the truth. Charles was dying, and the kingdom wasn't ready. In another time, Charles might have been allowed to die in peace. But this was Spain in the late 17th century. Peace was not on the menu. The fate of Europe hinged on the life expectancy of a man barely capable of speech. And so, the court wrapped itself in incense and illusion. It pretended the stars might reverse their course, that God might grant a reprieve, that enough relics might tip the scales back toward life. But beneath the prayers and potions, everyone knew the truth. Charles believed he was cursed. He may have been right. If Charles II's body was falling apart behind closed doors, then Spain's court did everything in its power to stage the opposite in public. The kingdom might have been run by incense and superstition, but it was presented to the world like a machine of imperial glory. And at the center of it all, silent, sickly, and barely upright, sat the king. As the 1690s dragged on and Charles's condition worsened, royal ceremonies took on a feverish intensity. Processions, masses, and courtly rituals multiplied. Not because they meant anything, but because they had to mean something. If the king was seen at mass, then surely he was recovering. If he waved at the crowd from a gilded carriage, then the dynasty still lived. The theater of monarchy became a daily performance of denial. On feast days, Charles was dressed in his most regal attire, robes heavy enough to crush a healthy man, let alone one who could barely stand, and placed before the public as a symbol of continuity. Trumpets blared, tapestries flew. The people cheered out of obligation or confusion, unsure whether they were witnessing a celebration or a funeral preview. Behind palace doors, courtiers scrambled to maintain the facade. Ministers composed speeches for a king who could no longer read. Edicts were issued in his name, though no one could confirm he understood them. At official banquets, his plate was filled, though he barely touched it. Toasts were made in his honor, while his own voice faded into incoherent whispers. No one could say aloud what everyone feared. Charles II was dying. Because to say it meant acknowledging the fragile peace that surrounded Spain was about to shatter. His death wouldn't just trigger mourning, it would trigger war. Not civil war, but a continental one. France, Austria, England, the Dutch, all were waiting, sharpening their knives, and watching for the moment Charles breathed his last. So the court clung to illusion. The Queen and her allies insisted that the king was recovering, even when he couldn't walk. Foreign ambassadors were led to staged audiences, where Charles would nod or blink on cue. Sometimes he muttered a phrase, rehearsed in advance. The more comatose he became, the more elaborate the charade grew. Palace records show a rise in expenditures for ceremonial garb, public events, and religious offerings. They didn't just dress up the king. They dressed up the entire court in the costume of functioning empire. The message was clear. All is well. Long live the king. Nothing to see here. But beneath the gold thread and incense haze, tension crackled. Everyone, nobles, clergy, ministers, foreign dignitaries, understood the stakes. The moment Charles died, the Spanish succession would explode into chaos. He had no heirs. The Habsburg bloodline in Spain would end, and the vultures were already circling. Each day that Charles lived, no matter how feebly, was a day without war. And so the rituals multiplied. One priest conducted mass continuously for 3 days in the royal chapel, hoping divine repetition would forestall fate. A parade of saints' relics arrived in Madrid, each more sacred than the last, each carried like a talisman against time. Meanwhile, the king, often unconscious, was moved from bed to throne to balcony like a sacred relic of his own. His body became a symbol, his presence a shield. Even the rumors of death that occasionally leaked into the streets were quickly stamped out by proclamations of divine recovery. "The king is well," said the messengers. "Long live the king." And inside the Alcazar, Charles II was wheezing through another day. Some believed that if Charles could just survive another year, a diplomatic solution could be reached. Others hoped for a miracle, a Habsburg miracle. But miracles had been in short supply ever since the inbreeding. In truth, the court wasn't just lying to the people. They were lying to themselves. The denial was so deep, so ingrained, that ministers competed over who could produce the most optimistic prognosis. Physicians doctored reports to avoid offending the queen. Confessors blamed Charles's condition on sin, others on bad air or planetary alignment. Anything but genetics. Anything but the obvious. And so Spain danced. It danced in denial. It sang praises to a king who could no longer respond. It offered prayers and staged pageants while the crown slid ever closer to a European powder keg. The court of Charles II, in his final days, was not a place of power. It was a stage, a wholly desperate, ridiculous stage. And everyone played their part. The impossible decision. Charles II of Spain had no children, no legitimate heirs, no secret bastards tucked away in monasteries or rumored offspring in far-off provinces. Just a barren throne and a gene pool that had looped in on itself so often it forgot how to swim. And so, in the closing chapters of his life, the most powerful decision Charles would ever make was not how to govern, or how to lead, or even how to live, but whom to name as his successor. It was a question no one could answer cleanly. The moment Charles picked a name, the continent would divide into camps, some preparing treaties, others sharpening swords. A Bourbon heir would mean France on Spain's throne. A Habsburg heir would mean Austria in control. Both options threatened the European balance of power. Neither promised peace. Inside the Alcazar, the court fractured. Ministers whispered behind velvet curtains. Envoys exchanged coded letters. Priests consulted saints. Even astrologers were asked to weigh in. The air grew heavy with suspicion and incense. Charles himself, sick, superstitious, and increasingly paranoid, became a prize to be won. His wife, Queen Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess with strong Habsburg loyalties, pushed for her Austrian relatives. She was backed by her confessor, Father Froilan Diaz, who saw the devil lurking behind any French ambition. They were the pro-Habsburg camp, defenders of tradition, Catholic orthodoxy, and imperial continuity. Or so they claimed. On the other side was Cardinal Portocarrero, Archbishop of Toledo and cunning power broker. Portocarrero had no love for the Austrian branch. He saw them as distant, cold, and incapable of defending Spanish interests. He backed the Bourbon claimant, Philippe, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. The French court, after all, had money, power, and more importantly, youth. Spain needed rejuvenation, not more incest. Between them stood Charles, drifting in and out of lucidity, trapped in his decaying body, and besieged by clashing voices. Some days he leaned toward Austria, other days toward France. At times, he seemed unaware of the stakes entirely. Doctors were summoned not only to treat his ailments, but to testify as political witnesses. Was Charles of sound mind? Could he sign a will? Could he even hold a quill? One royal physician wrote that Charles was like a child of 6, mentally. Another insisted he had moments of clarity. Everyone chose their expert accordingly. Pressure mounted from abroad. Louis XIV sent emissaries with lavish gifts and cryptic warnings. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I played the dynastic card. His wife was Charles's sister. England and the Dutch Republic, ever fearful of French dominance, sent veiled threats dressed as diplomatic niceties. The throne of Spain was not just a crown. It was a key to the future of Europe. In quieter moments, Charles expressed fear, not of war but of damnation. He feared choosing the wrong heir would endanger his soul. The Jesuits played on this. They warned that if he picked a French Bourbon, and war followed, the bloodshed might stain his soul eternally. Others whispered that if he chose Austria, he would doom Spain to foreign occupation. So Charles hesitated. He prayed. He fasted. He demanded signs from heaven. He stared at relics and hoped for divine instruction. Some say he consulted mystics. Others believe his final decision came after a vision, a dream in which a saint showed him the face of his successor. More likely, he was worn down. Portocarrero and the Bourbon faction pressed harder. The Austrian candidate, Archduke Charles, was distant, cold, and viewed as a puppet of Vienna. Philippe of Anjou, by contrast, had royal charm, the Sun King's backing, and a bloodline tied, however convolutedly, to Spain. In October 1700, Charles made his choice. In his will, he named Philippe as his heir. The document, composed in layers of legal padding and divine justification, argued that Philippe alone could preserve the integrity of the empire. He was young, Catholic, and strong. And though French, he would rule Spain as a Spaniard, they promised. Louis XIV assured the court that Philippe would renounce any future claim to the French throne. A lie, of course, but a convenient one. The will was signed. Charles's trembling hand left a crooked scrawl at the bottom of a document that would, within weeks, plunge Europe into a decade of war. The impossible decision had been made, and it would prove to be just that, impossible. When the name was finally revealed, Philippe of Anjou, the collective gasp could be heard from Madrid to Vienna. Charles II will name the grandson of France's Louis XIV as his heir, effectively handing the Spanish Empire to the Sun King's dynasty. Spain would not become French in name, perhaps, but in power and ambition? Most certainly. Philippe was a Bourbon, raised in the orbit of Versailles, bred on absolutism, and drilled in the divine right of kings. For Spanish loyalists who still clung to the fading glories of the Habsburg dynasty, the selection felt like betrayal by parchment. And yet, there it was, in ink that had barely dried before messengers raced to Paris and Vienna with the news. Charles II defended his choice as divine inspiration. He said he had received signs from God. He said France had promised to keep Spain united and intact. He said Philippe would protect Catholicism and uphold the traditions of the Spanish people. Or, at least, those were the words spoken on his behalf. Charles's voice, by that point, was largely ceremonial. Others were less charitable. The Queen wept. Her confessor raged. Habsburg loyalists accused the court of fraud. Austria cried foul, declaring the will invalid. England saw a red flag the size of Castile. The Dutch Republic prepared its fleets. The implications were colossal. Should Philippe ascend to the Spanish throne, France and Spain would be ruled by cousins of the same bloodline. The two most powerful Catholic empires in Europe, each with colonial interests, naval ambitions, and a fondness for war, would suddenly become one extended family. Louis XIV, who had already crowned himself as the living embodiment of absolutism, now stood to gain an empire that stretched from Naples to the Andes. To his credit, or his shame, Louis played it cool. Publicly, he hesitated. Privately, he celebrated. He sent Philippe off with advisors, troops, and instructions that could only be described as paternal micromanagement. Philippe was to rule as a Spanish king, yes, but a French one in spirit. The facade of independence would be maintained for now. But the long game was unmistakable. The European reaction was swift and predictably panicked. Austria declared its intention to uphold the rights of Archduke Charles. England, already wary of French ambition, began assembling alliances. The Dutch bristled at the idea of French ships sailing under Spanish flags. Even Portugal, ever the opportunist, started hedging its bets. Meanwhile, Spain tried to pretend everything was normal. Portraits of Philippe were commissioned. Coins were minted. Proclamations were issued in a flourish of Bourbon rhetoric. The young prince was hailed as Felipe V, first of his name, rightful king of Spain. The people, starved of leadership for decades, welcomed him with cautious curiosity. Better a young Frenchman than no king at all. But Philippe was more than just a face for the future. He was a symbol of what Europe feared, a united Franco-Spanish bloc with global reach. Colonial administrators in the Americas sent frantic letters. Merchants in Antwerp raised prices overnight. Even the Pope hesitated to offer full support. Back in Paris, Louis XIV raised his glass. "The Pyrenees no longer exist," he famously declared, a statement that sounded more like a war drum than a diplomatic slogan. Was it really a deal with the devil? That depends on your vantage point. For France, it was a masterstroke. For Austria, a provocation. For Charles II, it may have been the final joke of a cursed reign. A man born of incest, plagued by spirits, and mocked by his own biology, choosing in death to throw Europe into flames. But make no mistake, this was not simply the naming of a successor. It was the lighting of a fuse. In Versailles, the halls rang with applause. Louis XIV, the man who had styled himself the Sun King, watched his grandson ascend to the Spanish throne and declared that the Pyrenees no longer exist. It was not a boast. It was a declaration of geopolitical fusion. France had expanded, politically, dynastically, and ominously. Meanwhile, Vienna boiled. The Habsburgs, spurned and humiliated, seethed with righteous fury. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I considered the will not only an affront to familial loyalty, but a deliberate provocation by France. The idea of Bourbon Spain was, in his view, nothing short of dynastic heresy. And then there was London, newly stabilized under William III after the Glorious Revolution, and always suspicious of Bourbon ambitions. English pamphleteers railed against the coming threat. The Protestant powers saw in Philippe's coronation not just a royal succession, but a continental coup. One monarch's death had realigned Europe's power structure overnight. Louis XIV had promised that Philippe would rule Spain independently, and that he would renounce any claim to the French throne. Few believed it. Fewer still expected the Bourbons to respect those assurances once the ink dried and the troops deployed. And troops were deployed. Louis began placing French garrisons in key Spanish ports under the guise of supporting stability. Valencia, Cadiz, and Barcelona saw the fleur-de-lis waving beside the red and gold of Spain. The rest of Europe took notice. The phrase balance of power began to dominate diplomatic dispatches. British statesmen whispered it in Parliament. Dutch merchants feared monopolies. Austrian generals drew lines on maps. The Dutch Republic, perhaps the most vulnerable, began mobilizing ships in the Channel and North Sea. They had no illusions about a Franco-Spanish axis controlling Atlantic trade routes. Every port garrisoned by Bourbon troops was a potential customs gate, or worse, a military outpost. In Italian courts, where Spanish influence still held sway in Naples, Milan, and Sicily, whispers turned into warnings. Local nobles waited nervously, unsure whether to swear loyalty to Philippe or hedge their bets with Vienna. And so the board was set. The will of a dying king had accomplished what decades of diplomacy could not. It had united enemies, polarized allies, and set Europe on the slow, grinding path to war. England's response was perhaps the most calculated. William III began quietly preparing a grand alliance. Austria and the Dutch were obvious choices. Even Portugal and Savoy were considered. The goal? Contain France, fracture Spain, and if necessary, redraw the map entirely. Back in Madrid, the spectacle continued. Felipe V, Philippe's new Spanish name, was paraded through streets thick with incense and suspicion. Church bells rang. Poets wrote odes. Priests gave thanks. But behind the public adulation was an undercurrent of dread. Would this young French king rule as a Spaniard? Or would he serve as Paris's obedient proxy? The irony was bitter. For a kingdom obsessed with lineage, Charles II's final act was to hand the keys to a man outside the Habsburg bloodline. Spain, the empire of conquistadors and crusaders, now bore the face of Versailles. For conservatives, this was apostasy. For realists, it was insurance. And for France, it was a jackpot. The final laugh may have belonged to Charles II, if he had any humor left to give. By choosing Philippe, he ensured his death would reverberate far louder than his life. He had not conquered lands or founded dynasties. He had not fathered heirs or reformed the realm. But in dying, he triggered a war that would consume a generation. Across Europe, envoys were recalled. Ambassadors packed bags. Printers began running maps with new borders, some real, most imagined. Treaties were proposed. Armies were mustered. It was no longer a matter of if war would come. It was only a question of when. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700. His body barely cold, his will barely read, and yet within weeks, Europe's great powers were already moving into formation. It would take just a few more months before diplomats abandoned niceties. Generals brushed dust off old invasion maps, and kings started ordering more cannons. The will, naming Philippe of Anjou as the rightful heir, had shifted Europe's gravitational center toward France. Louis XIV rejoiced, but others began preparing for war. Austria called foul, declaring the will void due to dynastic betrayal. England, fearing a Bourbon hegemony, launched frantic discussions with the Dutch. The war drums grew louder by the hour. By early 1701, the Grand Alliance had begun to form. England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and a slowly growing list of smaller states coalesced under a single goal: to prevent the union of France and Spain under one crown. Officially, they spoke of defending balance, freedom, and ancient rights. Unofficially, they were terrified of Louis XIV becoming Europe's de facto emperor. The rhetoric in London turned apocalyptic. Pamphlets warned of French fleets in the Thames. In Vienna, Archduke Charles began preparing to assert his claim as the true heir of Spain. In The Hague, Dutch ministers whispered about trade routes and tariffs being choked by a Franco-Spanish monopoly. The war wasn't just about dynasties, it was about money, markets, and muscle. Back in France, Louis XIV made one final gesture that sealed Europe's fury. He declared that Philippe of Anjou would retain his rights to the French throne. In other words, Louis did not even bother to maintain the illusion of separation. If both he and Philippe lived long enough, France and Spain could, theoretically, merge entirely under one Bourbon crown. This wasn't diplomacy. This was dynastic domination. By May 1701, England and the Dutch formally signed the Second Treaty of the Grand Alliance. War was not yet declared, but troops were moving. Garrisons were reinforced. Ports were sealed. Spies were everywhere. Diplomats exchanged polite threats. Spain, meanwhile, found itself in a bizarre state of denial. Felipe V rode through parades, performed Catholic rituals, and acted every bit the Spanish monarch. But behind the grandeur was a political puppet show. Versailles called the cues. Madrid danced along. When war finally broke out in earnest in 1702, no one could pretend to be surprised. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun, one of the most sprawling, costly, and diplomatically tangled conflicts in European history. It would involve dozens of states, stretch across continents, and redraw borders from Italy to the Americas. And it had all started with a corpse and a signature. Charles II never led an army, never marched into battle, and never even issued a war cry. But in death, he launched a geopolitical explosion. His will was a loaded musket. His signature, the trigger. Historians still debate whether he truly understood what he had done. Was it divine inspiration, as he claimed? Political exhaustion? Or simply the last delirious act of a dying king who knew no other way to be remembered? Regardless of intent, the result was clear. The peace of Europe shattered, not with a clash of swords, but with a stroke of the pen. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700. His passing was solemn, yet for many in Europe, it was not a tragedy. It was the closing of a cursed book. At his bedside, the clergy whispered prayers, courtiers wept dramatically and somewhat performatively, and physicians pretended their tonics had done anything at all. After decades of decline, superstition, and diplomatic paralysis, the final Habsburg of Spain slipped away. His body was reportedly in such poor condition that the embalming process turned into a horror story. The morticians found themselves working on a man who seemed more mummified than royal, his internal organs barely resembling anything medical literature would recognize. The autopsy would later claim he had one shriveled testicle, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and a brain that had melted. Whether that was exaggeration or not, it was poetic enough to stick. What did Charles leave behind? Not children, not peace, not progress. What he left was a throne without direction, a realm with too many suitors, and a continent already spinning into chaos. The Spanish Habsburg line had ended, not with a bang, nor with dignity, but with a whisper wheezed through decaying lungs. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had ruled with ambition and iron. Charles V had been emperor of half the known world. Philip II had sent armadas across oceans. Even the lesser kings had maintained the illusion of order. But Charles II's reign had eroded all that. By the time he died, Spain was no longer the mighty hand of Catholic might. It was a weakened relic. Madrid tried to preserve ceremony. A grand funeral procession carried the king's body through the capital. Black banners were draped over royal buildings. Priests wailed. Bells tolled. But no one in Europe was fooled. This was not just the end of a man, it was the end of a dynasty, and everyone knew what came next. The vacuum Charles left behind sucked in powers from all corners of the map. The very act of dying had transformed him into history's fuse. By the time his corpse was sealed in the royal crypt at El Escorial, troops were already marching, navies were being readied, and alliances were tightening like nooses. The irony was heavy. A king who spent his life as a medical mystery, political puppet, and spiritual lightning rod had somehow become one of the most consequential figures of his age. Not for what he did, but for what he couldn't do, for what his death invited. In failing to produce an heir, in choosing a French prince, in collapsing at precisely the wrong moment, Charles II forced the world to answer a question it was not ready for. Who gets Spain? In retrospect, Charles became the ultimate warning about dynastic inbreeding, political inertia, and the dangers of hoping that things will sort themselves out. They didn't. His court's refusal to name an heir earlier, to face the reality of his health, or to acknowledge the coming storm only ensured that the storm would be bigger. And so, Charles II entered the history books not as a hero, nor even as a villain, but as a symptom. A walking cautionary tale. A royal whose very existence seemed to defy nature, medicine, and governance alike. He was the end of a line that had looped in on itself so many times it choked. Spain would now be ruled by Bourbons. The Habsburg dream, of a global Catholic empire stretching from Vienna to Mexico, was dead. And Europe would bleed because no one had the courage to tell Charles the truth while he lived. That he was the king of a crumbling stage, propped up by velvet curtains and terrified whispers. By the time Charles II died, Spain's glory was already a memory. His passing merely confirmed what most European powers had quietly suspected. The empire was rotting from the inside out. It hadn't always been this way. A century earlier, Spain had commanded the seas, colonized vast swaths of the Americas, and wielded immense cultural and religious influence. But the signs of decay had been building long before Charles came into the world, and by the time he took the throne, the rot was terminal. The most visible symbol of decline? The Spanish Armada. Its catastrophic failure in 1588 was more than a military blunder. It was a psychological turning point. The invincible empire had revealed its limits. That humiliation had rippled across the decades, undermining Spain's dominance and encouraging rivals like England and the Dutch Republic to rise. Then there was the silver, once the lifeblood of the empire, now a poisoned chalice. The endless shipments of silver from the New World should have made Spain richer than any nation on earth. Instead, they flooded the economy with easy money, inflated prices, and made genuine reform politically impossible. The treasury was full, but the state was empty. Bureaucracy became Spain's national art form. Endless councils, secretaries, and layers of aristocratic incompetence ensured that decisions were delayed, mismanaged, or never made at all. Local governors in the colonies acted like kings. Royal decrees took months to travel and were often ignored when they arrived. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's imperial machinery was grinding to a halt under its own dead weight. Religious orthodoxy stifled innovation. The Inquisition had drained the intellectual lifeblood of Spain for generations. While the rest of Europe was inching toward enlightenment, Spain was still hunting heretics. Universities became echo chambers for outdated dogma. Scientific discovery, economic liberalism, and political modernity were all treated as threats rather than opportunities. The nobility clung to archaic privileges while the peasantry starved. Even the army, once feared and respected, was a ghost of its former self. Recruitment was a nightmare. Pay was delayed. Morale was non-existent. Corruption filled the officer corps like a bad odor in a crypt. Charles II's death was not the cause of Spain's collapse. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence of imperial exhaustion. His reign, marked by passivity and paralysis, simply accelerated what was already inevitable. He wasn't the architect of Spain's downfall, he was its final tenant. The real damage had been done long before his sickly body took the throne. But the symbolism of his death was impossible to ignore. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs had passed, and with him, the illusion that Spain remained a global superpower. In reality, Spain had already been surpassed, militarily by France, economically by England and the Dutch, intellectually by Italy and Germany. The empire still held vast territories, but they were harder to govern and increasingly restless. The myth of Catholic universal monarchy, the dream that had driven Charles V and Philip II, was now a historical curiosity. The funeral bells that tolled for Charles tolled for an empire too. The end of his line marked the official death of the Habsburg dream in Iberia. Spain would never again rise to such dizzying heights. It would remain a player, yes, but no longer the referee. And so, the empire that once claimed the sun never set upon it found itself in the dark. Not with conquest, but with confusion. Not with rebellion, but with rot. The corpse of the king was entombed. But the corpse of the empire would remain above ground for many more years, slowly decaying while the world marched on. Charles II did not leave behind heirs, victories, or treaties worth remembering, but he did leave behind a masterclass in dynastic failure. His ghost lingered in every royal court that dared study the ruins of his legacy. Europe looked at his life not as a relic, but as a warning. Monarchies began whispering the unspeakable. That divine right might not be enough. That bloodlines too tightly knotted become nooses. That isolation behind palace walls breeds delusion, not wisdom. Charles was no longer just a cautionary tale in Spain. He was a grim fable passed from one crowned head to another. Medical texts began referencing the Habsburg jaw as shorthand for the price of marrying your cousin. Genealogists circulated Charles's family tree like it was a map of medieval genetic sabotage. What had once been royal policy, keep power in the family, was now seen as a fatal flaw. Even the most arrogant thrones took note. In France, where the Bourbons now ruled Spain, ministers walked a careful line. They celebrated their new domain while nervously eyeing the ghost in the crown. No one wanted Philippe of Anjou to become the next Charles II. Subtle reforms began. Advisors were chosen for skill rather than blood. Superstition was replaced slowly with pragmatism. Across the Channel, in England, the Glorious Revolution had already begun rewriting the royal script. Parliament, not birthright, began taking center stage. Watching Spain collapse gave British constitutionalists the best propaganda money couldn't buy. Look at them, they'd say. That's what unchecked royalism gets you. Even in Austria, where the Habsburgs still held power, the specter of Charles II forced hard conversations. The Holy Roman Emperor couldn't afford another branch of the family tree turning necrotic. Court physicians were instructed to track heredity more carefully. Marriages were scrutinized with a microscope rather than a herald's trumpet. And then there were the artists and philosophers. Satirists loved Charles. He was tailor-made for biting commentary. The king with no airs, no jawline, and no political instincts. Caricatures flourished. Pamphlets proliferated. Coffeehouse conversations in London and Paris turned his reign into theater. Even the Enlightenment thinkers couldn't help but poke fun. Voltaire himself would later note that Spain's decline was a miracle of inertia. Charles II was no longer just a historical figure. He was a metaphor. For dysfunction. For denial. For dynasties that confused tradition with stagnation. His life was dissected in salons and textbooks, his failures taught in universities. The very absurdity of his reign gave it power. He became, in the strangest twist, more influential in death than he ever was in life. The age of empires would not end with Charles, but the age of unquestioned monarchy was beginning to crack. A century later, revolutions would sweep the continent. Thrones would topple. Kings would flee or fall. And in the footnotes of every Republican's manifesto, there might as well have been a nod to the Habsburg disaster in Madrid. What had once been a house of gold had become a mausoleum of lessons. And Charles, poor doomed waterbrain Charles, was the skeleton rattling inside. When Charles II died on that grim All Saints' Day in 1700, the throne of Spain passed not to a native heir but to a French prince, Philippe of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. On paper, this was a diplomatic victory, a calculated move to keep the Spanish Empire intact under Bourbon leadership. In reality, it was the match that ignited a European inferno. France rejoiced. Versailles held balls and toasted the new unity between Spain and the Sun King's bloodline. But the rest of Europe was not celebrating. The Dutch Republic, Austria, and England saw the Bourbon succession as a direct threat to the balance of power. Spain in French hands? That was not just a royal shuffle, it was continental provocation. Within months, armies mobilized. Treaties were signed. The Grand Alliance was born, and with it came declarations, threats, and eventually cannon fire. Charles II had spent his life in a bubble of incense and denial, but the world outside was brutally real. His death had consequences. The War of the Spanish Succession would rage for over a decade. It would redraw maps, bankrupt treasuries, and slaughter hundreds of thousands. And it all began with a will written by a man who could barely hold a pen. Spain, for all its collapsing prestige, still mattered. Its American colonies, its ports, its prestige, all were pieces on a very expensive chessboard. The French Bourbon claim to the throne meant these pieces might soon serve Louis XIV's ambitions, not Europe's balance. And so, Charles's ghost haunted the battlefield. His corpse lay in the Escorial, but his decisions danced on the fields of Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet. The man who had never led troops, never won a campaign, and never fathered an heir had done something far more catastrophic. He made kings choose sides. Was it avoidable? Perhaps. But by the time Charles penned his testament, the machinery of decline had already ensured that whatever came next would be turbulent. He had been the final fig leaf covering imperial dysfunction. When he died, the naked ambitions of Europe's powers were suddenly exposed. Spain itself became a theater of competing puppets. French advisors flooded the court in Madrid. Austrian sympathizers stirred resistance. Local nobles tried to cling to influence, often changing loyalties like wigs depending on who held the capital that week. The country bled not just in battle, but in governance. In a cruel irony, Charles's desire to save Spain from disintegration by appointing a strong heir led directly to the opposite. The unity he tried to protect through succession became the excuse for dismemberment. Territories were traded, annexed, or contested. In Italy, in the Low Countries, and even in the Americas, the ripples of his death were felt like tidal waves. Charles II, in his final act, achieved what he had failed to do in life. He made history. Not through policy, not through reform, not through victory, but through sheer consequence. His absence mattered more than his presence ever had. And so, the Habsburg line in Spain ended not with a peaceful abdication or a managed transition, but with an explosion. The ashes of Charles's reign fertilized the soil for decades of war. His crown, heavy and hollow, had passed into the hands of strangers and lit a fire that would burn across Europe. Charles II never chose greatness. In fact, he barely chose anything at all. Yet his fragile frame, shaky hand, and muddled mind rewrote the map of Europe. Not with ambition, but by existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and in the wrong body. We laugh at his court of quacks, his haunted lineage, his medically improbable autopsy. But perhaps we should also feel a sliver of pity. Charles was less a king and more a vessel, of tradition, superstition, and political inertia. A man crowned at birth and condemned by blood. Spain's last Habsburg didn't start wars, forge alliances, or leave heirs. But his silence roared through the continent. His signature cracked kingdoms. His life warned against the perils of dynastic pride. History has known crueler tyrants and grander rulers. But few monarchs did so much damage by simply trying to stay alive. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Now sleep well.